皆さん、こんにちは。本日のウェビナー、日本の少子化第二次人口転換論と、ジェンダー平等の視点からということで今日お送りするわけですけれども、東京財団政策研究所研究主幹の小野と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いします。それで東京財団政策研究所の方で、現在、男女共同参画社会の形成と促進につながるエビデンスということで、研究プログラムを現在進めております。で、今日のウェビナーというのは、その一環として行われるものです。で、今日はですね、プリンストン大学のジム・レイモ教授にお越しいただいて、日本の少子化に関しましてお話をしていただきます。で、モデレーターをプリンストン大学博士課程の内越さんにお願いをしております。トークに入る前に少し簡単に我々が行っているプログラムについてちょっとお話をさせていただきます。で、男女共同参画社会の形成と促進につながるエビデンスということで、現在、研究プログラムを実施しているんですけれども、こちらのプログラムではですね、社会科学における、ジェンダー分野の研究、こちらに焦点を当ててですね、最新の研究に焦点を当てて、学術成果を日本語でお伝えしていく。これがまず目標の一つ。それから独自の調査を実施して、そこから得られる政策的インプリケーション、日本での応用可能性について提示していく。それから二つ目のゴール。それからですね、政策論議を活性化して、日本における男女共同参画社会の促進を目指す。この3つのゴールの下で実施しております。で、研究プログラムのメンバーとしまして、経済学、政治学、社会学、心理学、それぞれの分野からですね、奥山先生、勝谷先生、竹下先生、それから宮本先生、参加していただいてですね、現在プログラムを進めております。こちらがメンバーになります。で、このプログラムの中ではですね、学術成果を日本語で伝えるレビューを発行するほかですね、今後、政治家の方、メディアの方、行政の方へ、インタビューを実施していく。それから独自の調査を実施しまして、そちらを配信していく。で、さらにはですね、セミナー、シンポジウム、これらを開催していく予定です。で、今後のセミナーの予定としまして、2022年の11月25日に、アジアにおける、女性の政治参加、政治的代表に関して、国際シンポジウムを、京大学の三田キャンパスで実施する予定です。こちらもまた、後日広く宣伝をしていきたいと思いますので、よかったらですね、ご参加、のほどよろしくお願いします。それではですね、ここからウェビナー、いうことで、ジム・レイモ先生、に、お願いしていきたいと思います。で、トークの方は、英語に、なります。ということで、ここからはですね、モデレーターの内越さんの、マイクを渡したいと思います。よろしくお願いし
ます。Hello everyone. Thanks for coming to this webinar. My name is Fumiya Uchikoshi. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Princeton University. So I'm very much pleased to be moderating the talk and also introducing Professor Ramo. Jim Ramo, Professor Ramo is a professor of sociology, and Henry Wendt, the third professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He earned his PhD in sociology from University of Michigan in 2000, and since then, he spent many years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, almost for 20 years. Then he recently moved to Princeton University, and he also become the director of the Global Japan Lab, which is the Japan Studies Center at Princeton, newly established institute. And he's the expert in demography of Japan, if I understand correctly, including marriage, divorce, cohabitation, childbearing, and aging too. He basically studies the intersection of demographic change, one of the topic today, and also inequality. And also he's also studying changing patterns of family change and also family formation and dissolution. So if you see his CV, you will find so many papers are published in like top tier journals, including American Sociological Review, American Journal of Sociology, Demography, Journal of Gerontology, and Journal of Marriage and Family, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to his talk today. But just one quick remark. So after his lecture, after his talk, we're gonna move on to the Q&A session. And I assume you can raise questions mainly in English, but if you are comfortable with raising questions in Japanese, for the Zoom audience, you can put your comments and question in the chat box in Japanese, and probably I can translate, or I can directly deliver the question to Jim and Professor Raymond, and he can answer the question. So that's one quick remark, and with that, the floor is yours, Professor Raymond.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Ono for the invitation, and certainly would like to give my thanks to the Foundation and to Rieti for co-sponsoring this talk. I've been in Japan for many, many years, but this is my first opportunity to visit here, so I'm very happy to see some friendly faces and to meet some new people and to have an opportunity to share some of my work with such a large audience, a diverse audience. Unfortunately, I can't see you, but I know you're there. So it's a real pleasure to be able to spend some time thinking about issues that are relevant both to my own research, but certainly, as Professor Ono was saying, also to the research focus of the Foundation right now, low fertility family change in Japan. So before excuse me. Before I jump into the talk itself, let me just spend a little bit more time introducing myself. Not because I like to talk about myself, but because I think it's helpful to provide a little bit of background about where I'm coming from and where the ideas and the framework or way of thinking about things that I will share come from. As Fumiya just mentioned, I am in the sociology department at Princeton University. One thing he didn't mention is that I'm an affiliate of the Office of Population Research at Princeton. This is the oldest population studies center in the United States. I don't think there's really an equivalent kind of center at Japanese universities as far as I know. But the key point that I want to make here is that this is a place where we do population science, population research, and I'm a demographer, and demography is a minor field in every country. It's a very minor field in Japan, despite the important demographic issues that are relevant to sort of policy discussions about Japan. So I'm coming at this from a demographer's perspective, and if you are not a demographer, or I assume that's true of 99% of the audience, or if you're not familiar with demography, I think it's just important that I put that out there so that you have a sense of the background with which I am coming to these questions about low fertility and gender equality in the Japanese context. One thing Fumiya did mention is that I am the founding director of something called the Global Japan Lab at Princeton. I'm very excited about this. As he mentioned, this is the sort of Japan Studies Center, if you will, at Princeton. It's very small for the time being, but it's also quite unique, I think, in that it is not a conventional Japan Studies Center that focuses on everything from ancient history to art to policy or whatever. This is really a center focused on issues of global relevance in Japan. So we're particularly focused on demographic issues, population decline and aging, focused on response to climate change, response and preparation for natural disasters, international relations, particularly Japan-China relations. So I hope that there will be an opportunity to share with those of you who are interested more of the work that the Global Japan Lab supports in the years to come. So that's who I am. And I will just give you a brief overview of the talk so you know where I'm going with things and nothing will come as a surprise. I'd like to spend the first several minutes talking about low fertility in general, and something called the second demographic transition, or as was in the Japanese title, 第二次人口転換, a very unusual, jargony kind of expression. I'm sorry about that. And then, having defined the second demographic transition, would like to think about the ways in which what we observe in Japan with both respect to behavioral change and with respect to attitudinal change can or should be understood within this broader second demographic transition framework. I will define all of what I'm talking about as we go. And then, having done that, I would like to spend some time providing an interpretation of the data that I present to you. And I want to focus on gender issues. I want to focus on gender equality or gender equity and notions of gender essentialism, and want to bring in something that we refer to as the gender revolution or the female revolution. So one of the things that I hope that I can do is to convince you that understanding patterns of demographic change in the Japanese context, if we're interested in that, thinking seriously about the distinctive gender landscape, if you will, in Japan is relevant. What I absolutely do not want you to take from the lecture, from the talk, the presentation, or whatever, is a sense that, well, Professor Reimo came and told us that we should understand low fertility in Japan as a result of gender inequality in Japan. That is absolutely not what I want to say. I want to say that if we want to understand the patterns of change, thinking about the gender landscape and some of its distinctive features is important. So I just want to make that clear up front. So let's talk about fertility decline. This is a figure here that on the, let's see if I can make my cursor here, on the vertical axis is what we call the total fertility rate. This is the measure of fertility that you all are familiar with. Under some assumptions, it's the number of children that a woman might be expected to have in her lifetime. And this shows figures for Japan, the dark solid red line, and several other arbitrarily chosen low fertility countries, shows trends between 1960 and 2020. So there's a couple of things that I would like you to take from this slide. One is that fertility in Japan has been low for a long, long time. You can see that even as far back as 1960, or go back even a few more years to 1957, the total fertility rate was a little over 2. This is about replacement fertility. Japan has had replacement level fertility or below replacement fertility, 2, for longer than any country in the world. You can see some of the other countries. Korea, for example, is the green line. You can see that not so long ago, Korea had very high fertility. Korea just recently, if you were reading the newspapers, reset the record for the lowest fertility rate in human history at about 0.8, 0.81 or something like that. So Japan's fertility is not as low as some places like Korea or Italy, but it's lower than other low fertility countries like Sweden or the United States or elsewhere. So as I will discuss later, low fertility, protracted, long persistence of low fertility, especially below replacement level fertility, this is the central feature of the second demographic transition. And it's the reason we care about family formation, because persistence of low fertility results in, as you all well know, fundamental demographic changes of great policy interest. In particular, population aging and population decline. In the absence of large-scale immigration, which obviously Japan does not have, the figures in the previous slide, 60 years of low fertility, are the cause of these patterns here. The blue line is the percent of the population over age 65, and the percent is over here on the right vertical axis. You can see that in 1960, Japan was a young country. 7% of the population was old, over age 65. Currently, 2020 is the dotted black line. It's about 28, 29%, projected to increase to about 40% 2 in 5 people in Japan, if we believe these projections, will be over the age of 65 in just a few decades. Unprecedented. This is the oldest population in human history. Korea will pass Japan soon, but for now, Japan holds this distinction as the oldest country in human history. And as a result of population aging and persistent low fertility, we also see population decline. The total population of Japan is this orange line, and the number here in millions is on the left vertical axis. And as I think most of you know, the population in Japan began to decline 2007, 2008, I don't remember the exact year, but is now declining by about 600, 700, 800,000 people per year, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So these are the reasons that we really care about low fertility and understanding the causes and the background of low fertility. There are countless policy ramifications of population aging and population decline. I don't need to tell you about them. We can certainly come back to that in the discussion, the Q&A, if you want, but I think everybody is well aware enough of those issues that I can just leave it at that. So, I've been doing this for a long time. As Fumiya said, this is probably, about my 30th year studying demographic issues in Japan. And I have read hundreds of papers on demographic change in Japan, and could easily go find papers that would provide a range of explanations for very low fertility, persistently low fertility in Japan. These are just a few of the explanations that you would find in those papers. Growing economic independence for women, the high financial costs of raising children, educational costs in particular, the high physical and emotional costs of child rearing, perhaps particularly for women, the quality of single life, and limited incentives to marry. I think anybody spending time in a place like Tokyo realizes this is an incredibly convenient place to be a single person. And the argument here is that there are limited incentives to marry in contemporary Japan. Others might argue that there is an inefficient dating market, limited opportunities to meet partners in daily life. There's a lot of data to suggest that this is salient. We can talk about that more later. The media makes talks a lot about lack of interest. Young men and women have limited interest in sex, dating, marriage, family formation. I don't really believe that, but it's a popular explanation. I've highlighted a couple that I find particularly compelling and that I want to spend more time talking about today. And that's a focus on marriage roles. And this is where we get to the gender focus. And the idea here is that there are, as in any country, normative expectations about the roles that men and women may play within marriage. And those roles, the normative expectations with regard to those roles may be changing. I'll show you a little bit of data about that. But they may not be changing that fast. And to the extent that these expectations about what men and women bring to marriage or should bring to marriage are becoming less attractive or less feasible, then this is a potentially powerful framework for thinking about later and less marriage. And I'm going to show you later that in the Japanese context in particular, when we want to think about low fertility, we must think about marriage, because there is no extramarital childbearing as there is in most other countries. I'll show you data on this. So low fertility is really inextricably linked to later and less marriage. So we really need to think about the factors that explain later and less marriage. And here, particularly interested in thinking about 30 years of economic stagnation, wage stagnation, growing uncertainty in employment circumstances that make it more difficult to fulfill a sort of breadwinner type role, a primary earner role, particularly perhaps for men. And in that context, we know that women are increasingly engaged in the labor force. I had some colleagues who were very surprised to learn the Japanese female labor force participation is actually higher than U.S. female labor force participation. And largely that's due to changes in patterns of marriage. But it's also true that the prevalence of what we call breadwinner homemaker marriages, men working full-time, women not working at all, that has plummeted in recent years, and dual earner couples have become much more common. But with dual earner couple arrangements comes a heavy second shift for women, to the extent that women remain the primary child care providers within families. So this is where I'm really thinking about marriage, I'm thinking about gender, I'm thinking about relatively static expectations about what men and women bring to marriage, and thinking about the ways in which patterns of social and economic and attitudinal change may make those roles harder to fill. So that's where we're going to go. So that, I said, comes from the hundreds and hundreds of papers that have been written on precisely this topic in Japan. And there's tremendous value in country-specific analyses. Dr. Ono laid out a very compelling project focused on understanding patterns of family change or their policy implications in the Japanese context. That is absolutely essential. However, I would argue that as social scientists, often that's not enough. We want to cast a larger net. We must have variation. You can think about variation within a country, but it's often very powerful to think about variation across countries, particularly if we want to think about the generality of some broad theoretical framework. For any outcome of interest, surely there are people who have thought hard about trying to provide a compelling, convincing theoretical framework for understanding change. And to evaluate the generality of those frameworks, you can't just look at the US or France or Japan. You have to think about these countries in the international context. And that's what I want to try to do here a little bit, to bring Japan to these broader theoretical discussions about a second demographic transition. Not only is this important for generating insights into what's happening in Japan, but it's also important in thinking about how do we leverage what we know about the Japanese context to reformulate, to tweak, to refine these broader theoretical frameworks in ways that accommodate variation that we might not see, say, in Western Europe or something like that. So this is a critical exercise, I think, for those of us who are interested in thinking about broad frameworks for understanding social change or demographic change. And for fertility, there's a lot of reason to be interested in thinking about broad theoretical frameworks for understanding very low fertility, because most countries have below replacement fertility. These are all of the countries listed in the OECD family database, most recent years. And you can see, they're not all OECD countries, but you can see this black dotted line here. That's replacement level fertility, about 2.1 children per woman. And the vast majority of countries and all OECD countries are well below replacement. Japan is the red line over here. It's not the lowest, but it's one of the lowest at about 1.4-ish right now. Here's an interesting slide to me that I think is helpful for setting up the rest of the talk. I've taken the liberty of highlighting the countries in this database that are located in East Asia and Southern Europe. So China, Korea, Japan, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, maybe. I'd have to double check, but you know what I mean. All of these countries are well below replacement, and in fact, many of them are concentrated at the very low end of the total fertility rate. So this is kind of ironic if you think about it, right? These are the stereotypically strong familistic countries. A lot of Catholic countries in here, the Southern European countries. It doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface if you're not a democracy and you don't think about these things a lot, to think, why are children, is childbearing so low in these so-called familistic or strong family countries? Good question. I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to maybe try to think about it by recognizing that these aren't only strong family countries, they're also some of the most gender unequal countries in the wealthy world. Southern Europe and East Asia. I'll show you some data on that in a minute. And I am certainly not the first person to recognize that. And many people have talked about this in very compelling ways, and I will come back to this in the talk. So let's transition to think a little bit about what the second demographic transition framework really is. This is something it's a framework that was developed to understand the surprising emergence of below replacement fertility in Northern and Western Europe, Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, and so on. I'll talk a little bit about why below replacement fertility is so theoretically surprising and interesting to a demographer like me. But there's a couple of other factors or features of family change that are particularly relevant here. One is the declining salience of marriage as an institution and what people call the decoupling of marriage and childbearing. So the increasing prevalence of children born outside of marital unions and the growth in non-marital unions and by extension the growth of childbearing within non-marital unions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the explanations for this, but this is really a framework in which attitudinal change is central. There's a real emphasis on the role of change in attitudes in various domains that are thought to drive or promote the transition to low replacement fertility, the decoupling of marriage and childbearing, and so on. One of them is secularization, the declining salience of the church. Another is individuation, a move away from doing things for the family or doing things for society and doing things for yourself, pursuing your own individual goals, what demographers in this field call self-actualization. Actually, that's probably what psychologists call it, self-actualization. I get a nod on that one, so I know I'm right. Thank you. And gender equality, okay? So we're going to talk about Japan, and I would argue that none of these things are particularly salient in the Japanese case, which would superficially lead you to say, hey, so the Japanese case, we don't need the second demographic transition. It's irrelevant. None of these factors are salient for understanding fertility in the Japanese case. And I would argue that's why, if you look at those hundreds of papers that I mentioned, you will see very, very, very little reference to the second demographic transition. And maybe they're right. People who argue that there is no relevance of really thinking about this broader framework. What's going on in Japan is different. Maybe they're right. But I think that's too easy. And I don't want to let things sit there. I think there's tremendous value in, as I said earlier, trying to use our understanding of what's happening in a different context and to try to leverage our understanding of how different sets of circumstances, political, historical, economic, social, can lead to similar outcomes through somewhat different paths. There may be multiple versions of the second demographic transition. And if we don't pay attention to what's happening in Japan, well, we're left with a Northern European version of the second demographic transition, which may be fine, may not be fine. So I want to spend some time thinking about how Japan might fit in or not to this framework. So some of you may be listening, and you're hearing me talk about a second demographic transition. And thinking, well, hey, wait, what about the first demographic transition? And yes, there is a framework for the first demographic transition, which I won't spend much time on, but excuse me. Just to satisfy curiosity, I provide a very simple diagram here that for anybody in the audience who has taken any demography class, you saw this in the first lecture. This was on the first day of Demography 101 or Demography 201 or whatever it was. And it's basically the only real theory that demographers hold near and dear. And basically, this is how we view the entirety of human history. The horizontal axis is time, and at some distant past, there was an equilibrium. Population was stable. Population didn't grow, didn't shrink, because death rates and birth rates were both very high and about the same. That's most of human history. But then public health interventions happen. The death rate goes down, but the birth rate doesn't go down as fast. You can sort of see that here. The death rate goes down very quickly. The birth rate comes down much later. That's where the so-called population explosion happens. Okay, that's just history. What's really important for this talk is that we have another equilibrium here, where populations don't shrink and they don't grow. in the absence of immigration. They don't shrink and they don't grow because birth rates and death rates are roughly the same at very low levels. More specifically, at replacement. Okay? That's our theory. That's how we believe the history of the world unfolds. But it didn't happen, right? I just showed you earlier all of these countries that have fertility rates well below replacement level. And before that, I showed you that in many countries, Japan included, fertility has been below replacement for 50 years, 40 years, 30 years. How in the world do we understand that? And that's where this idea of the second demographic transition comes in. It's a framework designed to help us understand the social underpinnings of this theoretically unexpected emergence and persistence of below replacement fertility. Here's my simple diagram of how we think about the second demographic transition. It's all about attitudinal change and behavioral change and the self-reinforcing relationship between them. Not sure if behavioral change comes first or attitudinal change comes first. Let's just say attitudinal change comes first. Declining interest in following the teachings of the church, declining interest in formal marriage, increasing interest in pursuing your own life, which may or may not involve children, which may or may not involve marriage. This leads to behavioral change. As behaviors change, people become more accepting of those behaviors and of other attitudes associated with them. Feeds back into more attitudinal change. So this is really what the second demographic transition is all about. Thinking about the interplay between family attitudinal change and demographic change, behavioral change. So on the surface, how does Japan fit into this framework? Well, there's a lot of reason to think that Japan is the quintessential second demographic transition country. Maybe the first. It is a prototypical second demographic transition country by virtue of having nearly 50 years of below replacement level fertility. I showed you that, and I indicated that that was the longest period of below replacement fertility in the world, in history. Characterized by late marriage, more lifelong singlehood, and childlessness, which may reflect growing individuation, self-actualization that doesn't involve family, maybe not. Relatively high rates of divorce and remarriage. You all know this, but it's kind of interesting. Whenever I present work on this in Europe or the United States, people are always surprised by the rates of divorce in Japan. Well, I thought Japan was a low divorce country. You guys know better, and I'll show you some figures on this. But to the extent that divorce and remarriage is an important part of the broader second demographic transition, demographic landscape, well, Japan seems, again, to be a pretty typical country. And some evidence of changing attitudes with respect to secularization is a little difficult in the Japanese context. Religion is a little different, so let's put that aside. But changing attitudes towards gender, for sure. Changing attitudes towards individuation, self-actualization, pursuing your own interests. But what I would argue is that there's slower changes than we see in many other countries. And I'll show you some data on that in a bit. However, at the same time that there are these reasons to see Japan as a typical second demographic transition country, there are reasons to think, as I've already discussed a little, that Japan is absolutely not a place where we should be thinking about the second demographic transition. And in particular, the near absence of non-marital childbearing, which I'll show you in a minute. And I've mentioned this is a sort of central feature of the second demographic transition, the decoupling of marriage and childbearing. Limited evidence that cohabitation has emerged as an alternative to marriage. I want to show you some data from some of my own ongoing work with colleagues on this in a minute. Limited evidence of growing individuation. I said there is change, but it's slow. And people's responses to questions about individual pursuits in Japan, on average, look quite a bit different, maybe not surprisingly, than they do in France or Germany. And gender inequality. I don't need to tell anybody in the room the issues of gender inequality are important enough to focus on a whole research program, so we know that this is central to the Japanese landscape. So here are some data on marriage and childbearing. This is a simple figure showing a few countries, those same countries that I showed earlier, Japan, Korea, Italy, Ireland, and so on. The vertical axis here is the percent of children born in a given year to a mother who's not married at the time of birth. And you can see that many countries in the 60s, 70s, even the early 80s, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Japan, Korea, very, very limited non-marital childbearing. Sweden, of course, was a front runner in the decoupling of marriage and childbearing. That's the dark blue. The U.S. is the light blue line. But something really interesting happened in the 90s or thereabouts. You can see Italy, Spain, Ireland, rapidly increasing. Over 40% of children in Spain are born to unmarried mothers now. I remember the first time a colleague, Francisco Villari, presented evidence of the rising prevalence of non-marital childbearing in Italy. It was at a conference in Tokyo, and everybody looked at the slide and they said, "What? Italy? Really? 20%? We don't believe it." But yes, the prevalence of non-marital childbearing has increased dramatically, pretty much everywhere except East Asia. The two bottom lines are Japan and Korea, where you see it's essentially 0, 1 or 2%, and that hasn't changed. Here's another interesting thing. I told you, decoupling of marriage and the emergence of non-marital unions. This is the union status distribution of 20 to 34-year-old women in these same countries in maybe like 2018 or 2020. And blue are the percent currently married, green, the percent currently in a non-marital cohabiting union, gray, the percent in that aren't in a union at all, living alone or with parents or friends or whatever. You can see that about 30% of young Swedish women are living with a partner but are not married. In Japan, that percent is 1. So by far the lowest. So we will, you can see that in the cross-section, the prevalence of these kinds of unions central to the second demographic transition framework appear to be non-existent in Japan. I'm going to show you that this is completely misleading and that cohabitation is very common in Japan, but it's just short. And because it's short, you don't pick up many people in the cross-section, which is why it looks like this. But short cohabiting unions are not what the second demographic transition emphasizes. The second demographic transition framework emphasizes cohabiting unions that are like marriage, marriage-like unions. So again, this is reason to think that Japan might not really fit into this framework. So, let me show you some figures from ongoing work. This is work that I'm doing with 2 colleagues here in Tokyo and 1 young demographer who is now in Denmark. And what this shows is women in Japan who have recently married. So the horizontal axis here is the marriage cohort. So women marrying in the late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, and so on. And this is a simple measure of their pathway to marriage. Okay? The 2 blue bars are those who had any cohabiting experience with their husband. So did you live with your husband in a non-marital union before you got married, before you registered your marriage? So back in the 80s, about 18%. It's now about 40%. So 2 in 5 women who married recently in Japan lived with their partner in an unmarried union prior to marriage. So cohabitation is common. It's not as common as it is in the U.S. It's not as common as it is in Europe. And it's different than it is in Europe, but it's not uncommon. Here's something else that's really important. I mentioned that I showed you the figures for non-marital childbearing and said, well, the decoupling of marriage and childbearing has not taken place. And that is absolutely fundamentally true. But it does not mean that non-marital conceptions have not increased. And I think we all know that there is a lot of marriage in response to pregnancy in Japan. And some might even argue that pregnancy is one of the main reasons that people marry in Japan. We're talking about dekichatta kekkon here, right? There's obviously more technical terms for that, but what is the technical term? What is it? Ninshin senkou gata kekkon, right? Yeah. Very, very famous, not famous, very, very difficult demographic term. But at any rate, premarital conceptions, marriage in response to pregnancy. So what I've done here is to break down all of these marriages from the 80s all the way to the recent marriages by describing the pathway. And this pathway can involve any combination of cohabitation and premarital pregnancy. And I won't go through the details here, but you can sort of look at the slide and see the various combinations. The key point here is that in recent years, half of all marriages in Japan involve some combination of cohabitation and or premarital pregnancy. So this is not Sweden, it's not the US, but it is a country in which similar patterns of change are taking place. What's different is that they result in abortion or they result in marriage, these premarital conceptions, to a greater degree than is the case elsewhere. I think this is important. Another important thing in the second demographic transition literature is thinking about socioeconomic differences. Are these changes being led by highly educated innovators, people who can afford to do these new and perhaps non-normative things? Or is it largely driven by the low socioeconomic status groups who may be in an economic position where they can't follow conventional pathways, or maybe they have less to lose by following non-normative pathways? I think the clear, I will actually present on this in a couple of months, talking about very similar issues. But the conventional wisdom is that these kinds of second demographic transition behaviors are heavily concentrated among the less educated in most countries. And Japan is absolutely no exception. So what we have here on the left three bars over here, maybe right for you, are the 1980s marriage cohorts, high school and less, vocational school in the middle, 2-year college in the middle, university on the right, and then you have the more recent 2010 to 2015 marriages. And what you can see is that in both marriage cohorts, these non-normative pathways to marriage are much more common among the less educated. You can also see that among everybody, as I've already shown you, there's a huge increase in non-normative pathways involving cohabitation or premarital pregnancy. And you can also see that in the most recent cohort, about 1/3 of women follow the conventional pathway to marriage. You date, you get engaged, you register your marriage, you think about childbearing, become pregnant, have a child. That's 1/3 of marriages. It's about half of marriages involving women with at least a 2-year education. So a lot is changing. It doesn't map exactly onto what the change looks like in other countries, but it's changing nonetheless. And a couple of other things, I'm looking at the clock and I want to make sure I get to the gender part. But a couple of other things that I mentioned, Japan being not a low divorce country. This is work from a colleague, Miho Iwasawa, who I've written many papers with over the years. Ignore everything except the red circle, which basically says for women born in 1935, the light gray bar, and women born in 1970, the dark bar, if you married, what's the percent chance that your marriage ends in divorce? It increased from 10% to 26%. So 1 in 4 marriages to women born in the 1970s expected to end in divorce. That's much lower than the US, but as I said, that's about where it is in most Western European countries. Here's a figure from a study that I did, again, with Miho Iwasawa and a colleague named Larry Bumpus many years ago, where there's no model here. These are just data. These are just, we track people through their marriages. And you can see, for example, that of women born in the 1990s, this line here, I don't know if you can see my cursor moving here, open circle marker line, in 12 years, 20% of those marriages ended in divorce. And using a model, that's the line here, we project that about a third of marriages in the early 2000s end in divorce in Japan. So this is evidence in the second demographic transition framework of the declining salience of marriage as a social institution. It's not the case that marriages are forever and are important, to maintain at all costs for social normative purposes. Finally, of interest here is evidence on the point I mentioned about marriage. I said that in the context of a country like Japan, where there is no non-marital childbearing, understanding persistent low fertility requires attention to later and less marriage. And these figures show the trend toward less marriage. This is the percent of 50-year-old men and women, women gray, men orange, never married, percent of 50-year-olds never married. Demographers treat that as a proxy for the proportion who never marry. First marriage rates after age 50 are negligibly low. So this is the percent who never marry. You can see that back in 1970, 1980, Japan is what we call a universal marriage society. Everybody. Consistent with the central role of marriage as a critically important social institution. What happened since then? Well, I think you all know. Later and less marriage. About 30% of men now have never married. 30% of men age 50 in the 2020 census are never married. About 20% of women. About 30% of women are projected to remain childless throughout their lives. This is a fundamental change that may be consistent with arguments in the second demographic transition. A quick recap. I've already said that all of these explanations or sort of contextual features of the second demographic transition don't appear to be of great salience in Japan, attitudinal change in particular. But I want to focus on gender, as the title said, and to think about theoretical ways that demographers have articulated regarding the ways in which maintenance of high levels of gender inequality can result in low levels of fertility. Let me first start with just a little bit of background data. This is data from the Japan General Social Survey. It's a classic question about women's family roles. If mothers work, it has a negative effect on preschool age children. This is a question about the Sansaiji Shinwa, right, in Japanese. And the yellow are people who disagree, somewhat disagree or disagree. And the blue are people who endorse this sort of older view of the family, if you will. And you can see, as I said earlier, substantial change from about 50% to 39%, 50% in the mid-2000s to about 38% now. So a lot of change in Japan, but it's much higher than in the US, which is 29%. And it's much, much higher than it is in countries like France or Sweden. I don't think you can see this figure, but this is taken from the report of the National Fertility Surveys that my colleagues do here. And this is unmarried men, responses to attitudinal questions showing change over time. Again, let's just look at the red circled area. The one on the left, I've written the questions out so you can see them. The one on the left, which rose from about maybe 40% to 60%, is, do you agree that if you marry, you pretty much have to sacrifice half of your individuality or your own personal life? Marriage is a sacrifice, okay? 60% of men say yes, okay? And the other one next to it says, it's another classic question. Men should work outside the home and women should take care of the home. Agree or disagree? That fell from about 60% to about 30%. So you have views of marriage as a sacrifice for individual pursuits, but you also see marriage as an increasingly perceived the importance or the necessity or the value of a more egalitarian division of labor within marriage is clear. Japan is unequal. This is a figure from the 2022 Global Gender Gap Index. You all know this. published in the papers almost every week in Japan. It ranges from 1, Iceland up on the top left, to Afghanistan, 146 on the bottom here. Japan is 116. Japan is the lowest ranking country in the wealthy world on this, with only Korea and Malaysia even close. So by this measure, Japan is a particularly gender-unequal country. I think we all know that, but I would argue this is a pretty useless measure of gender inequality for the things I'm talking about. This measures things like education, representation in politics, CEOs, and so on. However, there are many other measures of gender inequality that may be particularly relevant for the things I'm talking about. Again, I realize that this is a somewhat difficult figure to see, but it's from a paper by a friend and colleague, Mary Brenton, at Harvard. And basically what she did was to take attitudinal data about men's and women's roles in the family. Same questions. If a mom works, it's bad for kids. Men should work, women should take care of the home. A woman can be just as happy as a housewife as an employee. Marriage is essential for women's happiness. Things like this. And she uses some analytical tools to classify people in many different countries based on their attitudes. And how does Japan fit in? Japan is in this little red box in the middle. I've picked a few countries, Italy, Spain, Sweden, that I've shown you before, just for contrast. I'll let you look at this yourself. But the full egalitarian, men and women are the same, should have fully equal marriages. That's the top area, the light gray. Very high in Denmark. Black at the bottom are fully traditional. Women should stay at home, take care of the family. Women derive their happiness from marriage, etc. Marriage and childbearing. That's high, was high in South Korea. It's high in Poland. Not high in Japan. What's really high in Japan is the dark gray, what she calls pro-work conservative. And basically, this is a set of attitudes that are fully supportive of women's work, but prioritize men's work. In an economic downturn, men's employment should be protected, or something like that, is one that's very different. And very high levels of women can be just as happy as housewives as they can as employees, or something like that. So it's a distinctive group. And I think what she argues is that this is really where Japan stands out. The high percent of people who are not traditional, don't have traditional views of gender equality, but have these sort of male first. And briefly, I have about 5 or 6 minutes left, I believe, so I'll try to be brief here. There are 3 different frameworks that demographers have put forth to try to understand how we might see low fertility in a place like Japan, a place like Korea, a place like Italy, a place like Spain, where these relatively gender inegalitarian views are prevalent. And this is the theory of gender equity. It's basically a theoretical framework designed to understand extremely low fertility in the familistic societies of Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece, so on. And basically the argument is it's all about tension. What happens when you have massive expansion of means opportunities in the public sphere? Education, employment opportunities, earnings, other kinds of individual pursuits. And you have relatively limited change in the private sphere, the family. Normative expectations about men's and women's roles remain relatively rigid. Well, what you have is an either-or choice. You can either choose to pursue a career or other individual activities, or you can choose a family. Work-family balance, buzzword here, is hard to achieve. And more women are choosing career and other pursuits. And arguably, we could say the same is true of men, whose primary normative role is breadwinner. There are a lot of men, in Japan in particular, who, in response to attitudinal survey questions, indicate they do not want to be the primary breadwinner, particularly in the context of stagnating wages and unemployment uncertainty. So this is one framework. Here's another framework that focuses on something demographers call the gender revolution, which is basically the emergence of fully egalitarian families. Women's increasingly equal engagement in the labor force, and men's increasingly equal engagement in the home sphere, child rearing and domestic work. And you can tell from this figure and my first demographic transition figure that demographers love equilibrium. This is another version of history seen through gender equality. There was some equilibrium in the past in which fertility was relatively high, and it was characterized by highly gendered division of labor within the family, breadwinner homemaker families. And there is some future, or maybe the present, for places like Sweden or Denmark, where we have relatively egalitarian division of labor within the family and relatively high levels of fertility. But in between, you have this revolution process. You have disequilibrium, and you have this sort of process through which increase in women's engagement in the public sphere slowly progresses, and even more slowly, men's engagement in the domestic sphere progresses. And during this period of disequilibrium, you have low fertility. And the argument would be that all of the data that we've showed suggest Japan might be somewhere around point. And then there's this notion of gender essentialism that is something that my colleague Mary Brenton, who I mentioned earlier, has spent a lot of time thinking about. I've cited a few papers on the right for those of you who may be interested. But basically, this is something that I've already said, I think, in different ways several times. In contexts where you have a normative endorsement of the idea that men and women are fundamentally different. They have different roles, different skills, they're by nature different, and they're better at certain things and should presumably engage more actively in the things that they are better at. I don't think these have to be articulated in an explicit way, but an implicit understanding that men and women's roles within the family and the work sphere are different. That's gender essentialism. And this is a normative basis for the breadwinner homemaker marriage, for wives as supplemental earners rather than equal earners. It's also the normative basis for intensive mothering rather than intensive parenting, which we might see in other countries. And basically, the argument that Mary Brenton and other colleagues make is that the residual features of gender essentialist views of marriage and family in Japan are such that changing attitudes, changing economic circumstances, make it difficult, increasingly difficult or increasingly less desirable to form marriages characterized by this kind of division of labor. Particularly, as I've already said, for men for whom filling the primary provider role may be increasingly difficult or unattractive, and for women for whom fulfilling the primary role of childcare may be increasingly unattractive or increasingly difficult in the context where they're also expected to be supplemental earners. So I think these are just three ways in which demographers think about gender, think about the gendered landscape, and how we can link features of the gender landscape to larger issues of interest like low fertility. So, just about 3 o'clock here. I will wrap up with a couple of concluding thoughts here. So I started out with the idea, this notion that it's important to think about Japan, not just from the Japanese perspective, but from a broad international framework. How do people who think about low fertility as a universal process, how might we make sense of what's happening in Japan? And have suggested that the second demographic transition framework may be particularly salient. And I think where I come down is not that Japan is completely unique and irrelevant. It's irrelevant to even think about Japan in the context of the second demographic transition. I think that's too simple. I think that it makes much more sense to think about the ways in which distinctive features of the landscape in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, we're doing a lot of work on this with other colleagues, may result in them sort of charting a distinctive path through the second demographic transition. It doesn't look like Sweden. It looks like Japan. But there's a lot of features of the second demographic transition that are there, but they're shaped by features of the social landscape that are less salient in other contexts, particularly the marriage-fertility link remaining strong. The view that children need a father and need a mother, regardless of divorce. At the time of childbirth, you need a mother, you need a father. This is a gender essentialist view of marriage that I think Katja Hertog and others have made a compelling case as being relevant. I've discussed attitudinal change and suggested that this is quite different in Japan than in other second demographic transition countries. The direction is the same, the pace is much different. And I've just at the very end summarized several general frameworks: gender equity theory, gender essentialism, and gender revolution ideas for thinking about the ways in which Japan's distinctive gender landscape may help us to understand why we see such low levels of fertility in a setting where some features of the second demographic transition are not present. Okay? But again, to reiterate what I said at the very beginning, this is not to say that gender inequality explains low fertility in Japan. Gender inequality is an important part of the social landscape for understanding patterns of low fertility in Japan. But obviously, social science is not chemistry or physics. Social science is messy, and everything is related to everything else. We need to think about gender inequality in the context of other institutional features like the labor market, like the policy environment, like the educational system, and so on. So I will wrap things up here. I thank you for listening and very much all your questions and comments. Criticism is welcome. So thank you very much for listening.
So, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Professor Raymond. So I think we can open up for Q&A. So there are already a few questions from Zoom audience, but I think so. If you feel if you have any questions, please put your questions and comments in the chat box. And if you feel comfortable asking questions in Japanese, you are more than welcome to do so. But before we have enough questions, I think we can take some questions from in-person attendees first. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm Hirosa Takenoshita, one of the members of the project organized by Professor Ono. So I have two questions and comments. First one is about the, welfare hypothesis you are using for your presentation. So you mentioned the importance of familiaristic welfare regimes for explaining the low fertility rate in Southern Europe and the East Asian countries. But on the other hand, for example, when it comes to the slide you presented concerning the link between marriage and childbearing, we found that, there might be the, growing divergence in the patterns of the link between the marriage and childbearing in countries and southern countries. So Spain and the case of Italy shows higher, more people actually decouple the marriage and childbearing. But on the other hand, actually the relationship between those two remains strong in Japan and in Japan and South Korea. So therefore, also I was making a cross-national comparative studies on the gender inequality in Southern societies by using the macro level statistics. So I think that especially since 2000 and the 2020s, so we see that more and more women in the Southern Europe became the managers. But actually this is not the case with South Korea and Japan. So therefore, my impression is that it might be quite difficult to make a strong assumption of those countries as familiaristic regimes. So therefore, my first question is about how those changes in the situation, the welfare regimes, actually in those countries may make a kind of the cross-national variation of the fertility rate across those societies. So this.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So I will first respond with a clarification, and then I will try to answer the question as best I can. The clarification is that I didn't want to suggest that I was talking about familistic welfare regimes, although I realize that those countries fall into that bucket of familistic welfare regimes. What I really wanted to talk more about was the sort of gender equity theories associated with Peter McDonald and others that don't really talk about policy so much, although they are reflective of policy, but talk more about the tension that emerges when you have growing opportunities outside of the family and limited change within the family, either or choice. However, a couple of things. One is that the ways in which that unfolds, that tension, which may be shared between East Asia and Southern Europe, may be shaped by policy, is certainly possible. Opportunities are shaped by policy, right? Educational policy, employment policy, welfare policy, and so on. I don't think that I know enough about the differences between the East Asian and Southern European, or probably more appropriately, the Japanese and the Italian, or the Japanese and the Spanish welfare regimes to make an informed speculation about the role of policy. I do think that one of the things that we see if we just take a look at OECD data, for example, which includes, of course, both East Asia and Southern Europe, spending on families and support for families is much lower in East Asia than in Southern Europe. And to the extent that that is sort of salient I think that one of the things that's really critical here, and I return to the work of Mary Brenton and Katya in particular, this comes from qualitative data. I'm a demographer, so I work with population data, but I love the qualitative data that people like Katya Hertog and others collect. And it seems very clear that as people contemplate a pregnancy, unplanned pregnancy, for example, and consider both normatively but also financially what that decision to have that child outside of entail, people choose marriage or abortion. And I'm rambling a little bit. I'm not answering the question directly. I realize that. But I guess I would just like to say that I think there's a lot of value in thinking more carefully about the fine points that distinguish the policy regimes between the two areas. That wasn't really what I wanted to talk about, but I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So, another question relates to the growing number of the people who are homosexual couples, because actually many of the demographers make the assumption that the couples are, heterosexual couples. But on the other hand, we see that some of the couples are homosexual. So, also this might be the case in Japan as well as the United States. But I've never read the articles about how demographers make responses to the growing number of homosexual couples. How do you think about that?
So, great question. This is a very timely question too. I don't remember, but this is not a criticism, but I'm sure you weren't at this year's Population Association of Japan meeting. There was a whole day devoted to sexual minorities and the demography of sexual minorities in Japan. And I think the simple answer there's a lot of answers to your question. How do demographers think about same-sex couples? Well, the first thing we think is that, like any other small group, population data, unless it's massive, is going to make this incredibly difficult to study. So on a tangent, I've done a lot of work on single mothers, and there just aren't enough single mothers in large population surveys, so we have to do oversamples of single mothers. We would have to do the same kind of thing, or like many of our colleagues at the Population Association meetings this year, you go out and you collect your own survey. The city of Osaka, Osaka Prefecture, Osaka City, collected a big survey on sexual minorities, which appears to be the basis for a lot of the demographic research on same-sex couples in Japan. But that doesn't really answer your question. I think a better answer to your question is that we need to do better at identifying them. There are large surveys, the census, or in the U.S., the American Community Survey, for example, or in many European countries, population register data that allow you, with some assumptions, to identify same-sex couples. So thinking about the prevalence and the characteristics of same-sex couples is obviously important. Asking the same kind of questions about union formation and union dissolution that we ask about heterosexual couples is obviously important. And in thinking about fertility, I think where we really need to spend more time thinking about issues like IVF, thinking about issues like sperm donors, thinking about issues like adoption. I think all of these are sort of on the fringe discussed in the media in Japan. I certainly see from time to time discussions about parenting and children in same-sex couples. And I think, a demographer's response is you got to measure it. And I think figuring out how to meaningfully measure the presence and the arrival of children in same-sex couples is critical. Yeah. No, that's a great question.
Thank you. So before moving on to the Zoom question, I will take a question from Professor.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. My area is South Asia, so I don't know very much about it. I'd be interested in a follow-on question to the first question that we had about the state. And in fact, how worried is the Japanese government, the Japanese state, about the declining fertility? And whilst there have been a policy, as far as I understand, that women should go back into the workplace, is there a parallel policy in making it possible for women to have children and go back into the workplace through early childhood education or early childhood care centers that are easily accessible, particularly for those who are working class backgrounds?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that, I can't speak for the Japanese government or policymakers, obviously, but I think that concerns about low fertility, the implications for shrinking labor force, the implications for population aging, population decline, these have been issues of high policy relevance. Since I was a student here 30 years ago, I remember reading the Kosei Hakusho or whatever from 1989 or something, and it was about low fertility and issues related to family formation and the policy relevance. So yes, I think that this has long been, maybe it has been an issue of political policy relevance in Japan for longer than maybe anywhere else except the Scandinavian countries. With respect to the question about policies, I remember being here about 10 years ago in a symposium on demographic policy, and we had somebody from a think tank there, and she came and told us what many of us already knew, which was that the Japanese government has implemented probably every single policy that you could possibly imagine that is designed to promote, facilitate family formation, childbearing. And, there's a lot of argument that, well, look, nothing has happened. It's still low. Fertility rate is still low. Well, one response to that might be, well, it could have been lower in the absence of those policies. I don't think that there's any real clear evaluation of the extent to which these policies have been effective or ineffective. And I think simply saying, fertility hasn't changed, ergo policies are ineffective is probably not the best way to think about things, because we don't know the counterfactual. The counterfactual could be a Korea TFR of 0.8. I don't know the answer to that. Having said that, I do think that there are a lot of ways in which policies, or the policy environment, I guess I should say, was not conducive to family formation. Classic examples are the long waits for public daycare, public childcare in large cities in Japan, the difficulty of returning to work, the difficulty of work-family balance. I don't know. How many hundreds of papers have you read on work-family balance in Japan? This has been a policy issue for quite a long time. And I would argue that Japan has a very generous policy environment with respect to facilitating the balance of work and childcare at young ages, certainly relative to the U.S. That's a bad comparison. Maybe the worst comparison. But Japan is a relatively generous public support environment, I believe. And I think that there does appear to be evidence from the data that I work with that more women are staying in the labor force around the birth of their first child. More women who leave the labor force temporarily are returning to the labor force after the birth of their first child. So that hasn't translated into higher fertility rates, I don't think. But at the same time, I think that there is evidence that some of these policies have been effective. So, having said all of that, I don't think it. Sure, we can be critical of policies for being ineffective, but I think it's hard to find, with a couple of exceptions, maybe France, Sweden, countries that have been very effective at using policy levers to dramatically increase fertility rates. It's proven difficult in many places. Yeah, but the answers are yes, yes, and yes. Yeah.
So one related question from Zoom was, what would be sensible policy to influence to raise TFO in Japan? So it seems that some current policy include encouraging women's labor force participation or providing financial support raising children. What would be effective policy tool to influence attitudes?
To influence attitudes? Well, I don't know. Let's be honest. I mean that's a very. I mean it's obviously the important question. I think that all social scientists are going to say that attitudes are highly insensitive to policy levers, and it's a lot easier to use policy levers to influence things other than attitudes. Let me respond as a demographer by returning to a couple of the things that I showed you in the presentation. If you want to increase the total fertility rate in Japan, it's important to recognize that conditional on marriage, the fertility rate hasn't changed for 50 years. Conditional on marriage, the completed fertility is about 2. Maybe right now it's about 1.9. But completed fertility, that is the number of children actually that women who marry have in their lifetime, is about 2. And it has been for decades. What you really need to focus on if you want to raise the TFR is marriage or non-marital childbearing. So it's unlikely, in my view, that suddenly married couples in Japan are going to start having more children than they've ever had in the past 50 years. I think that's not realistic. I think that if you want a higher fertility rate, total fertility rate, which reflects both marriage, childbearing within marriage, and childbearing outside of marriage, you need to focus on the latter two, marriage and childbearing outside of marriage. Childbearing outside of marriage, for the gender sort of essentialist reasons I've discussed and that colleagues like Katja Hertog have talked about repeatedly in their work, suggests to me that it's unlikely that we're going to see a Spanish or Italian rise in non-marital childbearing in Japan. I wouldn't be completely surprised, but I'd be somewhat surprised to see that. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with a scenario in which the real focus, if we're interested in raising total fertility rates, is to somehow use policy to promote, facilitate marriage, if that's going to be the primary locus for childbearing. And that really requires us to think about why we have relatively low levels of marriage in Japan. And there are, as many of you know, 31 flavors of explanations for why marriage is so low. I mean, I'll try to be consistent and go back to what I talked about in the presentation and think about the ways in which it appears that the maintenance of normative expectations of a relatively sharp division of labor within marriage is increasingly unattractive or less feasible. So I know, of course, going back to policies, the many policies. One of them was the ikumen policy, or the not policy, but the promotion of husbands taking more care of their children, being more invested in their in the child rearing, and using famous people who are good papas to try to encourage more time spent with children and a more gender equal division of labor within the household. I don't think that one worked particularly well for a variety of reasons. But many people argue work hours, for example. I think that it's pretty much a consensus that we know from data that Japanese married men spend less time on child rearing on an average day than pretty much any other country. I think Korea is close, but Japan may be the lowest. And I think the conventional wisdom is not that Japanese men are uninterested fathers, but that work hours are long and that there's relatively limited time and energy to invest in child rearing. So here's an answer. Workplace policy. To the extent that workplace policy could facilitate a more gender egalitarian marriage that would be more attractive and more feasible for people who are interested in marriage to take that step is one possibility. I could talk about this for hours, but I'll stop.
Another policy-related question was so I think like access to reproductive technologies, one important part of the SET theory, if I understand correctly. The one question was, I had a question about the role of oral contraceptive pills. Japan adopted the pill quite late compared to other OECD countries, and take-up rate is still low. Could it be possible that the decoupling of marriage and childbearing have something to do with the late adoption of the pill? I.e., marriage serves as the form of contraceptive. Do you have any thoughts, Jim?
That's very interesting question for a lot of reasons. I hadn't thought about the role of the pill or other effective types of contraception in quite that way. However, demographers are centrally focused on the role of sexual frequency and contraception in thinking, obviously, in thinking about fertility. And here is an area, as the person asking the question obviously knows, where Japan is a complete outlier in the world, and that is with respect to the contraceptive basket, if you will. Mix of contraceptives used in Japan looks like nowhere else in the low fertility world. Rhythm withdrawal and condoms are, of course, the least effective types of contraception, and it's somewhat of a mystery as to how Japanese fertility is so low in a contraceptive environment like that. I actually don't have a good answer. I mean, I think the conventional answer is low sexual frequency in marriage, but I don't know that. So I think this is a question that is really important to think more about, and again, as demographers can measure better. Are we undermeasuring abortion of unplanned pregnancies to unmarried women? I don't know. Are Japanese couples incredibly effective at using ineffective contraceptive methods? I don't know. And I think that if marriage, so I think the conventional wisdom about the relationship between marriage, sex, and contraception is that marriage should be, as I've suggested, absolutely promotive of fertility, to the extent that sexual frequency is higher and contraceptive use is lower within marital unions than it is in non-marital unions. But again, I don't really see that, to be honest. I would love to talk more with whoever asked the question about this, because it's a real thought-provoking question. But my initial answer, without more time to think about it, is I don't really think that's part of the story. If anything, it's a mystery as to why fertility is not higher in Japan, given the contraceptive environment.
Thank you. So there are two questions about divorce. So one is how do you think why the divorce rate has risen in Japan? And another question is asking, I think the question is about like a great divorce. So is there any study on the connection of timing of divorce and SDD? The person wondered if the late divorce, the great divorce, has any effect, influence on the SDD theory.
Great. Great questions. Yeah. Divorce is really important. Let me kind of talk about something a little bit different before returning directly to the question. So I think one thing I didn't really talk about is the link between divorce and fertility. And this is important because, as I mentioned, about 25-30% of marriages in Japan are projected to end in divorce. Importantly, about 40% of those marriages do not involve any children. So remarriage and childbearing within subsequent unions, marriages, is critically important for understanding the number of births. And it's also clear that many divorces take place in families with one child. The number of children in single mother families is lower than the number of children on average two-parent families. Meaning, again, that to the extent that divorced mothers or fathers don't remarry and don't have more children, or do remarry and have more children, then this has critical implications for understanding overall patterns of fertility. And this is something that I'm working on with colleagues right now. So the first question was about explanations for divorce in Japan. And I think based on the research that we've done, the research that colleagues, I will mention one, MJHL, used to be at Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training, now at Nihon Joshi Daigaku, has done a lot of interesting work on this. Reasons for divorce in Japan are the same as reasons for divorce everywhere, I think. Growing incompatibility is one. Infidelity, gambling, financial problems, domestic violence. All of these are listed as reasons for divorce, and I think these are quite common in other countries as well. I think one of the more interesting things is less about what women or men say was the cause of divorce, but to think about the characteristics associated with divorce. And in our own work, it's very, very clear that divorce is much more common among those with lower levels of education, lower status jobs, lower levels of income, all of which suggest that financial stress is a reason for marital dissolution in Japan, as it is everywhere. So I think that's important. And then with respect to gray divorce and the SDT, that's a good question. I think that at a general level, my answer is no. There's not salience of gray divorce for the ideas of the second demographic transition, which are really about family formation and family dissolution in young adulthood, prime childbearing years, which is not gray divorce. But let me just, since you asked, I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that, in a society where we saw relatively low levels of divorce at younger ages, or shorter marital duration, and a concentration of divorce at higher marital durations, perhaps when the children have left the home and are independent, that might be evidence of a family environment, a normative environment, social environment that is less consistent with the second demographic transition to the extent that it reflects adherence or support of marriage as a social institution for raising children. And couples are waiting until they have fulfilled that obligation, that social obligation within that appropriate social institution, to divorce, to dissolve an unhappy marriage. But I don't know if I even believe that. Since you asked, I thought I would go out on a little bit of a limb and speculate there. Thanks.
Sure, thanks for asking many questions. There are actually like 12 questions unanswered yet. But I think that it seems the time is already over. So I just want to Ono sensei.
どうもありがとうございました。今日は、ジムネイム先生、プリンストンから、お招きしまして、大変貴重な、レクチャーいただきました。どうもありがとうございました。そして皆さん、ご参加いただき、ご視聴ありがとうございました。終了にしたいと思います。